Plain Truth, the show where we try to get into some of the mysteries of the world around us. I'm your host, Plain, and joining me this week is Tina Foster, who's done work on doubles, replacements, and the question of whether the current Paul McCartney is the one that we used to know and love. Tina, are you there?
I sure am. How are you?
Fine. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. It's an interesting topic, and I'm glad you could join us. And along for the ride is my friend Jerry. Jerry, are you there?
Hey, guys.
Hey. Well, Tina, why don't we just get to the start of how did you get interested in doubles or the question of Paul McCartney? How did that happen?
Okay, well, I was doing research on something back in August 2008, and I came upon a link to Sun King's PID website, and I really thought there'd be nothing to it, and I'd look at it for a minute or two and move on. But I fell down that PID rabbit hole. It took me...
let's mention what PID. It means Paul is dead. That's kind of a... Some people might not know that, but it's used... There are a couple things used in this world. One is Paul is dead, and the other is fall, as in fake Paul.
Yeah, or faux Paul.
Mm-hmm.
So I started looking at Sun King's research, and it took me a couple of days to really see the difference. But when I did, it was a revelation. And at first I was very upset that they had been able to do that. And then I got angry and I set out to expose it as best I could. So that's been about 4.5 years now. So August 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, so what were a couple of the highlights that basically made you feel that this is not the original McCartney?
Well, I could see anatomical differences myself, such as differences in eyebrows, eye color. Paul was a well-known, he had brown eyes, and then starting with Strawberry Fields Forever, they show green eyes, almost in a taunting way on the video. They show it 3 times at the same time as the song says, "Nothing is real." Also, Full on the Hill, they're showing his green eyes. And some other differences that I noticed were height, just difference in head shape. They look different.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 2009, in July, we had some forensic scientists come out in the Wired Italia magazine, and they actually proved that Paul had been replaced, and they had some forensic evidence that was very helpful for our cause.
Mm-hmm.
And these 2 forensic scientists were Francesco Gavazzini and Gabriella Carlesi. And they had they explained in the article that they had first gotten involved in PID research. They wanted to prove that it was just a hoax. It was this long-standing rumor, and they wanted to show that it wasn't true. So they set out, that was their goal when they set out, and they actually ended up showing that he had been replaced. They saw differences in the nose, the jawline, the ears, the lips, the teeth, the palate, and the shape of the skull. And anybody who's studied doubles knows that one small difference is enough to give away a double. So you have this whole list of differences that can't be explained by error or plastic surgery, then it's simply not the same person. So I have some of these things on the blog, and I've talked about them before, but some of the difference, more specifically, were differences in the nasal spine, which was something that couldn't be changed by surgery. And they hinted in the article that the mustache that Fall started sporting in late 1966 was actually there to conceal the difference in that part of the nose. Then they said that the lips, for example, the oral commissure, which is the line that's formed when the upper and the lower lip meet, that it was quote, suddenly stretched in 1967, which was technically not possible. They saw differences in the jawline or the mandibular curve. And so before 1966, the jaw had two curves, but in 1967, it had one curve. And the difference was over 6%, which was well beyond the margin of error. Then the palate, Paul had a small palate. So it was 1966, before the switch supposedly occurred, basically. Paul's palate was small, and it caused his teeth to become misaligned. But after Sergeant Pepper, or starting with Sergeant Pepper, the palate was much wider. Mm-hmm. And this couldn't be explained with surgery, because even if technically that the surgery could have been possible back then, it would have been very traumatic, and braces would have been involved, breaking, the palate would have been involved in inserting a prosthetic. And so, I mean, these things didn't happen. I mean, Paul McCartney was a singer. He's not going to do all of that to himself.
But Tina, we don't have a problem, because there are all these photos from 1966 and before, right? Except they're all bought up by one rich guy, right?
Right. So that, yeah, I mean, we've definitely come across instances of photo tampering. And
the biggest, for listeners, the biggest collector in the world by far of early Beatles stuff is Paul McCartney. He has an almost unlimited budget, and he could easily put together 2 or 3 museums of all of his stuff, and that makes it very hard to compare, because there's actually not that much out there for people, I think.
Well, there are people who have been involved in PID research who have collected, or their parents collected, and so it is possible to get untampered photos, but it can be challenging, and it is kind of fun to actually find the tampered pictures and then call them out. I mean, there's some really bad hack jobs out there. And I have a post on the blog about that, where there's one picture from Memphis, August 1966, and it is such a bad hack job. It's so obviously a tampered photo of Paul. And I actually wrote the people who were selling the picture, and I'm like, how are you selling this obviously tampered photo? Because if you look at it, it's basically what they've done is they've taken the top half of Paul's face and put the bottom half of Paul's face on it.
Yeah, well, there's so many things. One thing that, Tina, different people look at things from different angles, right? Some people are into photos. Some people would be into the music, the sound of the voices, and things like that. But I can say one thing that I found particularly surprising is that Paul McCartney did not attend his father's funeral.
Right.
And I found that to be really quite surprising. I mean, that's so unusual. I mean, even if you don't have the best relations with your father, you're going to attend the funeral because it's also a family event. And I just found that particularly interesting. So there are not just these photographic differences. There are also questions about that. And then when I first looked into this, one of the things that stood out to me is that basically the earlier Paul had what I consider to be a very, very good sense of humor. And the more modern Paul had what I would consider to be no sense of humor at all. And now, the counter argument, Tina, though, is that a lot of people are going to say, look, they started doing drugs and, going to India, and that this changed everything. Their personalities changed dramatically and so on. What can I say? That's possible. But certainly there are factors besides pictures or measurements of how big the lips are, stuff like that. There are these other factors that are quite interesting to some of us anyway, like, as I say, not going to your father's funeral.
Well, the drugs won't change somebody's physiognomy, won't change the teeth alignment, won't change how the ears are placed, it won't change the shape of the skull. it won't change the voice prints. So,
Oh, Tina, speaking of voice prints,
mhm.
I seem to recall that there was some professor in southern Florida who did an analysis. I think it was of Strawberry Fields Forever, and said there were something like 3 Paul McCartneys on that. Does that
Right.
sound familiar?
Yeah, that was Dr. Henry Truby in 1969. He did voice prints on Yesterday, Penny Lane, and Hey Jude, and found that there were 3 different voices.
And this is a professor, and he got in trouble for that, right? Or at least under a lot of pressure.
Right, to not make that too public. That is what I heard too.
Mm. Well, I'm just pointing that out because I don't know. Like many people, I've done a certain amount of singing and studying of singing, and to me, there's definitely a difference in McCartney voices. So it's not so surprising to me, but some people don't feel that way, and so it's just something to put out there. But so we have this question of how could they pull that off, and what do you think? Do you think it's just that people go through life and don't see anything? What is when you show this to people, what reactions do you typically get?
Well, a lot of people on the internet are seeing it now. A lot more people are seeing it than when I first got started, or even a few years ago. Um, it's it's hard for some people, but other people can see it. I don't I don't know. I don't really confront people with it very much anymore, because if they want to live in their little illusion world, great. It's not where I want to live, and other people who want to have an idea about what's really going on will find the information, and if it resonates with them, then great. Then there are more people who are kind of more clued in, and hopefully the more people who know what happened to Paul will know about the use of doubles and imposter replacements, and then when that happens, it then they'll notice it, and the powers that be won't be able to get away with it as easily. So,
Well, Tina, you brought up doubles, and I think now in a more political sense. So I think it's important for people to realize that they're used all over. Um, we remember reading about Saddam Hussein having, 10 or so,
at
right?
least seven, yeah.
And one imagines that other political figures in the modern world do that. I mean, there was talk that Vladimir Putin had hurt himself in some sporting thing, and so he wasn't out and about very much for a couple of months, that kind of thing. And that makes perfect sense. And it also makes sense that in certain countries, let's say in the Middle East or something, where there are a lot of assassination attempts floating around,
Mm-hmm.
that anytime you go out in a car, you'd want to have 2 or 3 fake cars just in case a plot to blow up your car happened.
Sure, and actually one of Saddam Hussein's doubles was assassinated by the Shiite Dawa. That was 1984. So,
Yeah, there's
So
actually a
you,
good documentary out about his son or Uday and his double called Latifia. I think they made it into a docudrama as well. And for anybody that thinks this is hard to believe, you should see this man's story because it'll blow your mind.
yeah, he defected because they were going to force them to have another plastic surgery to look more like Uday. I haven't seen the movie, but I've researched Saddam Hussein a little bit.
Well,
So,
Uday was actually a lunatic, a psychopath, and it got to the point where he was, about to kill this guy for pretty much nothing. So he essentially had to use the skills he learned as a double to bluff the border guards and escape into another country. And it was quite fascinating.
okay, great to know.
well, you can see how this is just in some senses a low-level example. This is, the son of a leader, right? And so you can imagine how dramatic it can be for others. And so, it shouldn't be so surprising that people in power want to do this. And so now we would get to the question of, well, are the Beatles that important? And I'm going to say they were, because they were like Britain's number 2 source of revenue, foreign exchange at that time.
Sure, and the head of RCA at the time, or while the Beatles were in their heyday, said John Lennon was more influential than any head of state in the world.
A lot of people say they were a Tavistock creation too, so they may have had a lot of cultural value. Let's put it that way.
Well, I would say that the Beatles were co-opted and made into but they were co-opted by the Tavistock Institute, and that's what you see when Paul was replaced. See with Sergeant Pepper.
So you don't think they started off Tavistock? You think that sort of at some point crept in there?
No, I think that they were co-opted. I think the band was infiltrated, hijacked, co-opted by Tavistock, and that occurred with Paul's replacement, and the others were replaced as well. It's not as easy to see, but it's there, and there are physical differences.
One thing I kind of wanted to throw out, and I don't know if I should mention any names. Let's call him, say, San Antonio Silverbug as a nom de plume. Say this particular person seems to see doubles everywhere, and some of these seem really dubious. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but I'm wondering what you think of this person's research.
I'm not familiar with that person. Silverbug, no.
Nah,
That's a fake name, but Tina, there is the question that as we're seeing more and more suspicious events around, like at shootings, school shootings, and not just that, but a lot of these seem to be full of actors and drills, and we have to wonder if these aren't just fake, events. And it could be a mix, right? It could be that some of them are real, some of them are 100% fake, and some of them are half fake. But there is that issue.
Sure. So psyops, psychological warfare, trying to promote their agenda, gun control agenda, creating fear in general in people. I've seen pictures where it looks like ketchup, it's not blood. Actors that are popping up in different places. For example, the Batman killer, that was, help me with his name, the one who was accused of it versus the guy in the courtroom with the orange hair. It's not the same person. And then the quote lawyer is an actress who was in Sandy Hook, I believe. So these actors that are showing up in these different psyops scenarios.
Yeah, it looks like there's a mix of things going on, and then some of them we can't totally tell because you can't research some of. You would think that some of these lawyers should be well known, but you look into them and you can't find anything about them. So, which is in and of itself rather surprising. You would think that there would be more information on some of these folks, but we could get into the rabbit hole of Sandy Hook or whatever. But the point is that there could be reasons for powerful people to get into the use of doubles that is a lot more than just protecting a leader or something, which is easy to imagine. There's also an idea of controlling a court trial, for example.
Sure. Yeah, and if you're talking about leaders, one example is Kim Jong-il, who is acknowledged as being dead now, but a few years ago, Professor Shigemura from Tokyo wrote a book about how Kim Jong-il had actually died and been replaced or had four doubles that were pretending to be him. And that was how the military elite of North Korea were maintaining control.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be surprising. I mean, you could argue that it's just a military dictatorship to begin with, right? And that, in a sense, that guy's just the PR front for it.
Right.
And so if he's gone, what difference does it make? Right?
Right.
And the son perhaps was too young at that point or whatever to roll him out or something. So anyway, the point, though, is that there are all these possibilities that it makes sense that you would use a double. And, even with U.S. presidents, I think that some of them, when they're cutting ribbons or whatever, or getting some of those don't quite look 100% like the real thing to me.
Well, there was an article with John Kerry, quote, John Kerry, a couple of months ago, and people noticed it was not John Kerry. It did not look like John Kerry. And, I just think it's interesting when the general public spots a double.
I call him the Frankencarry. It looks like a corpse they dug up and injected with something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but having the doubles for these presidents, one of my friends, who's also a lawyer, is really big on baseball, and he mentioned he doesn't know too much about doubles or anything, but he mentioned that when George Bush went out and threw a strike at a baseball field for some game, I don't know what game it was, some big game, he actually thought that it might have been a double for Bush, because my friend plays baseball all the time, and he didn't think he could throw a strike. So just have a president waltz on out there, doesn't play baseball regularly, and throw a strike. It's pretty incredible. So just a little positive publicity thing for the president. It's not a big deal, but it is, in a way, influencing people. And
there's the other side to this, that a president could look kind of foolish if he threw the ball and it hit the dirt or went wild. He would look like he isn't very well coordinated or whatever, and he wants to, particularly Bush wanted to seem like a kind of macho can-do guy.
mm-hmm.
So his image would be damaged. And so, why take the chance? If you're an advisor, why take the chance? Put in somebody who looks like him who actually can throw a strike.
Exactly.
It's what I would advise if I were working for them. And I wouldn't even think twice. So the point is, if you've got these doubles, and then I think, on YouTube, I think there are a couple of doubles who looked a lot like Obama and Bush. And actually, I think there even a case where comedians died who looked a bit like them. Or I don't know if you remember that. But anyway, this is kind of specific, and it's not really the important thing. But the thing is, historically speaking, in modern times, like World War II, we have famous generals that we know usually were what we saw were not the real thing.
Right. So General Bernard Montgomery, for example, had a now famous double named Emmy Clifton James, who was actually used for spreading disinformation in North Africa to the Germans. So he was talking about a Plan 303, which was the fake invasion of southern France. So he was going around and talking about this, and the Germans were getting disinformation, and it did help the war cause, I'm sure. But Emmy Clifton James had been an actor and studied with, or he studied Montgomery's actions and movements, and he had to quit smoking because Montgomery didn't smoke, and he had lost a finger in World War I, and so a prosthetic middle finger was made for him. And I've seen pictures of Montgomery and his double, and I can't tell the difference. They look exactly the same to me.
I was thinking in the older times, I'm sure there were doubles then as well. The advantage I guess they would have had back then is they wouldn't have had the mass media and the colored television and everything chasing them around that we have now. On the other side, what the advantage they would have in modern society would be the advantage of plastic surgery and prosthetics that weren't available then.
And well, the plastic surgery, the special operations executive from England was using plastic surgery in World War II. So it's probably started earlier than some people realize. And prosthetics, well, at least World War II.
Tina, there's another side to this, and that is that acting, actors have been a part of the intelligence community for a long time. I forget which one it was, but one of the Doctor Who's worked for like high-level intelligence in World War II. Might have been John Pertwee, but I don't remember which one it was now. But essentially, reporting directly to Winston Churchill or something like that.
Yeah,
and it was classified for 20, 25, 30 years or something like that, but then later it came out. But the point is, it's entirely possible that you see somebody on TV like Errol Flynn or whatever, and in today's context, I don't know who that would be, but some popular movie star, they could be working for intelligence regularly. That's not surprising. It's actually common.
Right. Well, there are rumors that Houdini was working with intelligence. And, well, basically when you, oh, I know who it was. The guy from, I believe it was the dating game. One of those
Chuck
types.
Berry or something?
One of those presenters, TV presenters, because they could travel.
Chuck Woolery, I believe.
It might not have been him. I don't want to lead people astray, but it was somebody like that who it was. It's easy for the actors to travel, and they have a cover story for why they're traveling into a country, and then they can engage in espionage or whatever they need to do with that cover story.
Well, also, they can work as intelligence agents because there may be something that they want to put in these, like you're talking about. Maybe the Beatles became a Tavistock project.
Mm-hmm.
There can be agendas besides just spying. There can be an agenda to promote drug use. There can be an agenda to promote violence or to promote fear or, that kind of thing. Make guns look bad or, there could be all kinds of agendas. And actually, it's so common you take it for granted. I mean, the military in the U.S. helps make movies. They will spend millions and millions of dollars and give you free use of jet fighters or military bases or all kinds of things if you portray the military in a positive light.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that Top Gun has been identified as one of those propaganda films that was gearing up for the war in Iraq. So getting people all excited about being a fighter pilot.
Yeah, let's
Sure.
not forget Angelina Jolie and George Clooney are CFR members as well. So obviously, they're going to be pushing agendas.
Right.
And Tina, you've probably heard a little bit about Laurel Canyon and Dave McGowan's work there. And there's certainly, that was the government's key, documentary, movie, whatever source. And they did use regularly famous Hollywood actors. And, it's just, look, modern entertainment, movies and songs, all that kind of stuff is too important for the powers that be to not pay a lot of attention to. I think Plato essentially said that to control or change a society, control its music. It's really that important. I mean, look at music today, rap and stuff compared to the music of, let's say, up to 1965. A very different society, very, very different. Getting back to McCartney a little bit, I think some people have mentioned that in those early, it looks like if he was changed, it was around late 1966. Is that a general thing that you would go along with?
Yeah, I actually think that he was replaced between August 25th, 1966 and August 28th, 1966. Definitely replaced by December 66. But my research would say that Paul played the Seattle concert, August 25th. There were 2 days of downtime. And then there's a press conference in LA on August 28th. That is not Paul anymore.
Tina, what's this? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, what's this? I heard a story about allegedly Paul crashing his car and dying with a girl in the car. Do you know anything about that? Is there any validity to that? Or?
Oh, yeah, that's, when the first stories or reports of Paul McCartney having died came out, it was beginning of 67 when it first started being talked about in England. People were talking about how Paul had been killed in a car crash. Then in 69, that it was revived in college newspapers. And I am not sure where these people got these stories. I think they were looking at the clues in the songs and making up a story about what happened. So they're saying, oh, lovely Rita. Rita was the woman in the car. There's like stupid bloody Tuesday. Oh, that's the day he died, which was like November 8th or something. And they're just using the song clues to piece together what happened to him, which is maybe not a bad way to go. But with more information now, I don't agree with the car crash story at all. I think that's disinformation.
So, well, what's your best guess as to what happened?
I think he was assassinated. I think they had a double ready to go, and they had an opportunity. They took him out. They put the double in, and that was that. Because it takes, okay, like if it had just been a car crash, an accident, a simple accident, there would have been, well, first of all, it takes time to find and train a double. So they had somebody ready to go if it's a 2-day time frame. And if it had just been an accident, a crash, I would just imagine it would be complete chaos. Nobody would know what to do. That would have been out. They might have been able to suppress it later, but there would have been reports. Paul McCartney dying in a car crash? That would have been all over. But it was very controlled. Whatever happened to him barely leaked out to anybody.
So what do you make of, one more question, Plain. What do you make of all the clues and the hints in the album pictures and all that? Do you think that they're sort of just throwing it in our face? I mean, a lot of people would argue that they did the same thing with 9/11. There's all these little double entendres and hidden clues that are almost begging to be found. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so reportedly there have been 400 clues that have been found, referring to Paul McCartney having been killed and replaced. 400, that is a lot. So I do feel like they're rubbing it in people's faces, making a fool of people. But it might be because if it's the Illuminati behind it, their code of ethics says that they have to tell people what's going on. And if the people don't complain, then it's like a consent to doing it. So they put all these clues out there. Look, Paul is dead. There's backward masking. There's reverse speech. There are tons of album clues. Fall himself is always saying stuff like that, like, oh, there's me and the famous him, and I don't want to say I'm schizophrenic, but really I'm like two people. And he's constantly saying things.
Almost like it's hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Well, is he a Rosicrucian?
You know what?
He likes wings, right?
Well, he has. You know what? He has the Red Rose Speedway. He's got the rose stuck in his mouth, which is like a symbol for silence. I mean, I would not be surprised if he were a Rosicrucian.
Well, let's just say there are a lot of reasons to think he has the, what shall we say, the attributes of someone who's in some secret society or group or, low-level member or something. But, regarding the question of the car crash, there are a lot of issues. I mean, first of all, if he was assassinated, I would think that they would want to do it in a way that they could lie to the family and band members and make it look like it wasn't an assassination.
Right, so a car crash.
Unless they had like a crazy lone gunman kind of scenario, and then they could just say, we don't know, a crazy fan did it. And, here's the best guy at some Beatles imitation concert, and let's try and see if he can, do the studio album or what, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But, a car crash, I don't know. Maybe McCartney did like driving recklessly or too fast or whatever in a sports car, and maybe it was a believable scenario. So, even if it's an assassination, you can make it look like a car crash. That is fairly common. I mean, Princess Diana and all that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I think that would be believable to his family or something. I mean, if you're his brother and you've been warning him, hey, don't drive so recklessly, and then you find out he dies in a car crash, you're only going to have your doubts later, a few years later or something. You're going to say, there's something about this that doesn't smell right. But at the time, you'll be in shock and you'll go along.
Yeah, that's a plausible scenario.
Well, that actually raises one of the points I was curious about. What does McCartney's family think about this rumor that it's not actually him, Tina?
Well, they deny it. I mean, there was back in '69 when it was being spoken of publicly and internationally, there was somebody on a show with evidence or was talking about how Paul had died, and Mike McGarrett was there, and he said, oh, it's not true, but I mean, you know, you can say it's not true. It doesn't mean that it isn't true. I mean, we don't know why. I mean, okay, look, they could have been blackmailed. Oh, they could have been first. They could have been said, well, you're going to go along with this for God and country, right? Okay. They could have been blackmailed. They could have been threatened. I would say Heather Mills was definitely threatened. They could be silenced. Mal Evans, possibly Brian Epstein. That, you know, there's different ways to deal with people. Discredited. Heather Mills was discredited. What if Heather Mills came out now and said Paul had been replaced? Well, she's been vilified in the media. They're just going to say, well, sour grapes.
So
Plus,
if there was a conspiracy, then I guess the only answer would be his family would have to be in on it. I mean, there's no way, no matter how good a double is, you know, you're not going to fool your own mother, right?
no, well, his mother was dead, but yeah, his father was alive, and they went along with it for whatever reason. Heather Mills didn't. And she married him, probably thought he was the original Paul, found out he wasn't, totally freaked out. You know, she was being threatened. She said publicly that she sent evidence to somebody, and if she were killed, that evidence would come out, and she was getting death threats, and
There's a lot of money involved for sure.
Oh, yeah. She said there's a lot of fear of the truth coming out from a certain party. So she came really close to spilling the beans on Fall, but she didn't. That, you know, she said that someone she loved had betrayed her, and it wasn't infidelity. And if people didn't want to know the truth, they'd be too devastated. And
yeah, I think I saw that interview. It was really strange what she was saying for sure.
Yeah. Well, strange unless you know what she's talking about.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Exactly.
Well, you know, getting back to the car crash thing, though, I think there is a lot that people might not know. I mean, some people say there's a sketch from John Lennon that looks like a Beatle with his head, you know, smashed and the brains dripping out, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a head wound in general, though. That could be being shot, or it could be a car crash.
Well, it doesn't prove a car crash, but nonetheless, I mean, the car crash idea is really quite common, and so maybe there is something to it. I don't know. I think I might disagree with you a bit in terms of them covering it up. I think they could cover up a car crash if it happened in the middle of the night somewhere because, you know, how many people are out on the road? And like you said, God and country, if they can get his family to cover something up, they can certainly get an ambulance driver.
Well, there's still the problem of having the double ready to go in 2 days.
Oh, sure. But I'm saying if it was an assassination behind it, they would have been ready. But
right.
Yes, if it had been a pure accident, no. But it's kind of, you know, this whole thing goes beyond the accident idea, don't you think? We're sitting here talking about there was a Tavistock project there.
Right.
The promotion of drugs and perhaps some violence and various other things. I mean, and then maybe it's worth going into, but a lot of people think that the original McCartney was trying to push an I don't know what you say, an upbeat, a positive view of the future, using music in a way to get everyone's vibration to a higher level.
Yeah, a rise in consciousness. So using music and right.
And even for example, on your blog spot, plasticmaca.blogspot, there was something in there with the famous JFK conspiracy writer, the lawyer, Mark Lane, talking about how Paul McCartney wanted to basically help write musical scores and such to promote the idea that the JFK killing was an assassination by powerful forces.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an incredible thing to think, because you realize the pressure that would have been put on if McCartney had actually done that. I mean, the powers that be would have been so angry at him using his fame to say that, you know, it was an inside job.
Oh, right. So Mark Lane, he wrote a book called Citizen Lane. He talked about how Paul McCartney actually was interested in talking to him about the JFK assassination, he did not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter. And he offered to write the score for Rush to Judgment, which would have gotten a lot of people in the movie theater just because Paul McCartney wrote the music for it. So just imagine the amount of attention that movie would have gotten just because of Paul. So a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't have been confronted with these problems with the JFK assassination story, that they might have started asking questions, and it just would have been a big mess. So that is I think one very good reason to take Paul out. And I think that also because they were speaking out against the Vietnam War already in 1966. They were critical of government and taxation with Taxman. They were just loose cannons, from what I could tell, that they were not team players. They were not going with the agenda. And they were too big. They couldn't be controlled. So, and you mentioned furthering the drug agenda before, and Fall was the first British pop star to talk about taking LSD. And that certainly got a lot of people interested in that drug, which was a psychochemical warfare agent. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, think about today. I mean, I don't know, imagine if Elvis Presley had been going out saying, Kennedy was killed by the CIA or something like that. I mean, just imagine, we're so used to nothing. We get now, all we get is CFR guys and gals who tell us, go contribute to some charity that promotes vaccines in Africa, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, you have to have grave doubts about because they brag at how it will cut population significantly. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, so you have all kinds of doubts. And here's a guy, and then there's McCartney was talking, he didn't like the modern musical scale, the way it had been changed. He was trying to promote some of the older music, which, there's a movement in classical music to go back. And it definitely seems like it had a more positive, uplifting sound.
Right. So Dr. Leonard Horowitz has talked about how music was actually militarized by instituting the 440 hertz.
Yes.
And so basically it's an unhealthy, so when you say make A 440 hertz, and that's sort of the international standard now, but it's not a very healthy frequency for people. It can actually make them ill, aggressive, mentally unstable, I suppose. So that was part of an agenda using music. But for example, the Beatles, they used 432 hertz on Help, for example. And the 432 hertz is it vibrates more in harmony with the body, and it's healthier, and it's better for you. It's more for a connection spiritually. For example, a musicologist named Brian Collins has talked about using the A equals 432 hertz tuning as part of a musical therapy and to further spirituality. So,
Yeah, well, I think they did it for more than just a few songs. And I seem to recall people like Keith Richards complaining that, from his point of view, the Beatles were not in tune or whatever.
Yeah. It was, wasn't Keith Richards, but it was, I know who you're talking about. I'm sorry, I just totally blanked on the name. Cliff Richards, that's what it was. That's who it was, sorry.
Okay.
Cliff Richards said that they were out of tune, but really they were tuned down.
Yes. And so this is another angle here as to why powerful forces in Tavistock or wherever could just say they're off the reservation. They're not doing, they're not promoting what we wanted to promote.
Right, and they didn't have to because they had, in my opinion, they got where they were because of their talent, their charm, their ability, and they were not under the control of the powers that be because they had made it on their own, so they couldn't be controlled. So now you were talking about how you get these vapid pop stars, celebrities who push whatever agenda, and it's because they don't have the talent. They did not get there on their own. They were pushed and supported, and they are they don't have the talent to make it on their own. So they are dependent on the powers that be to keep them where they are. So they have to promote whatever agenda they're told.
I was just gonna throw in, if you listen to some of these singers like Britney Spears without the auto tune, it's ghastly.
Right. So, and you can listen to Paul McCartney. People have isolated the tracks on different songs, and it's funny to listen to Paul McCartney like on The Night Before versus Fall on I don't know, pick one of Fall's songs. Lady Madonna or something, I don't know. And it's just, oh, wow. But Paul had a really beautiful voice, and he didn't need a vocoder.
Well, you can see how, in a sense, this is part of this agenda. They've made music a weapon, and they've damaged society tremendously with this weapon. And here was a guy who was trying to use it in a positive way, and that was just not the agenda. And the thing, though, is unfortunately a lot of people can't see this. They don't realize the power of music, and then they don't realize that they really did change. There was quite a difference in like early McCartney and late McCartney. And so we're left trying to figure out, is it proof that it's two different people or even three? Do you think that, a lot of people talk about there being 3 or 4 McCartneys. What is your thinking on that?
Well, as far as people standing in for Paul, were there multiple falls? It's possible. I mean, they could use voice doubles in the studio, which would account for different voice prints. Was there one person public Paul McCartney, quote Paul McCartney? It's really hard to say because partly the photo tampering makes it difficult, and
well, there's like the use of a picture, right? Like, was it Denny Lane? Some people think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think Denny Lane was the person at EMI Studios in December of 1966. Now, was Denny Lane fall for longer than a couple of months? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, but I'm very certain for myself that Denny Lane did stand in as Paul. And
right,
I mean,
but there could be pictures, but yes, but there could be pictures, and then there could be singing, right? They could be right, and then there could be a guy walking to the studio out of the car, right? So there could be different kinds of doubles and replacements and what have you.
Oh, absolutely. They could have had voice doubles, and then a public Paul fall. Anything is possible. They could have had recordings of Paul that they used on later albums, which I think did happen. They could have had imagery of Paul that they used later. Now it's very easy to have holograms or CGI or voice morphing technology to fool people into thinking somebody is somebody else. But back then, what was the state of technology for these sort of psyops? I know that Howard Hughes was talking about in 1972 how then it was possible to use computers and a telephone to convince people that somebody was still alive. But
well, that could be. I know somebody who got invited to something where they had holographic images and such, and it was in the early 70s, and it was actually already it was one of these research things, like a DARPA kind of thing, and it was good enough then to blow people away. I mean, it would work today if you'd seen it. And so that was in the early 70s.
Wow.
And so, they're decades ahead of what we get to see. Right? So, we just can't know. But anyway, though, the point is, it could well be some mix of different voice technologies, people, doubles, photos, blending, all kinds of stuff. Because, let's face it, even with the JFK removal, there may have been a lot of photographic massaging.
Oh, right. Well, the Life magazine cover with Lee Harvey Oswald, that was a fake photo. That was tampered.
Well, what do you mean? The shadows go in different directions. The sun is more flexible now than it used to be, or something like that. So that's another angle. Now, what do you think of the research out there about McCartney? Do you think that, it looks like you've got a lot of disinfo thrown around, all kinds of stuff. Do you have any thoughts on, what can I say, where the research is going? I mean, there's like the YouTube thing. What is it? The apple? You know what I'm saying?
Are you talking about the rotten apple? I'm a phone.
Yeah, that one.
Well, I know that person's house was burned down and he had to flee where he was living. And I don't want to say publicly who that was or anything more, but I know somebody was working with him on those projects. And unfortunately, I do know that I Am a Phony had his own ideas and agenda that he was trying to promote with the sort of occult angle. And not that I don't think there was an occult angle, but I think it was when the Beatles were co-opted. So that the original Beatles were actually nice people. And that was why they were replaced. So
I had read that McCartney had exchanged letters with Manly Palmer Hall. Does that ring a bell to you? Do you know if that's true?
I don't know. We might have to say more about that.
Well, let's not forget they had Aleister Crowley on the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts cover, right?
Right. So Aleister Crowley, so he's a British Secret Service or secret agent, MI5, co-founder of Tavistock Institute, famous occultist. I mean, there's a reason why he's on the album cover, which was a funeral scene, which was telling everybody that the Beatles are dead and they're new Beatles.
Speaking of that, Tina, do you think the Beatles designed those covers themselves? I mean, I highly doubt it, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
I do tend to think that the Butcher album was Paul McCartney trying to expose satanic ritual abuse. Because it's such a bizarre cover, and he really pushed for that. And if it's true that he wanted to expose that, it might be another reason why they wanted to take him out. Because as soon as that album hit the record stores, it was pulled.
And also there's some strange things on the Abbey Road cover too. I think like Paul isn't it? He's all dressed in black or something, and he's the only one that doesn't have shoes on.
Yeah, the Abbey Road cover has been seen as a clue to PID since the beginning, really. That was one of the clues that Fred Laborde looked at when he was trying to figure out what happened to Paul. So that was back in '69. So people say that John Lennon in white was the funeral director, or Ringo was the funeral director. Well, one was the spiritual leader, John was the spiritual leader, Ringo was the funeral director, Fall was the corpse because he was barefoot, and then George was the gravedigger. And then you had the white beetle, which I think was a symbol for Paul. It had 28F on the license plate, which Paul would have been if he had lived. And people also said LMW was Linda McCartney Weeps, but who knows if that's what it was supposed to mean. On the back, it had the blue dress. The girl in the blue dress with like Paul's face in it. And people have said it was the French actress that Paul supposedly had a crush on. I'm blanking out on her name right now. But yeah, different clues on different album covers. So was the White Album, for example, it was a double album, so was that hinting at a double? Sergeant Pepper was, wow, that's a really obvious, a lot of clues on that one, with the grave, the wax effigy Beatles. On the back it had Fall with his back turned to the audience, and it had Without You next to his head. Yeah, then just
Well, there were
lots of
also
clues.
movies, right? I mean, the like the animation, the Yellow Submarine, that seemed
Right.
awfully
Hmm.
suggestive that
Yeah.
something was wrong.
Yeah, so Yellow Submarine has an imposter Beatles band and playing a bubble. Well, another Beatles band. So there's two sets of Beatles in the movie that they're showing you. And uh, there's just there's so many clues. I mean, like I said, there have been at least 400 clues people have found. On the White Album, they have the song Glass Onion. And it says the walrus was Paul. And, that's 1968. So that was before PID became big international. Uh, Something that people were talking about on a large scale. So the walrus was Paul. Walrus backwards is Sir Law, and Bernard Montgomery was known as Sir Law. And Bernard Montgomery had a famous double. And apparently Paul has a famous double. So,
Well, there was when he went on the David Letterman show.
yeah, and
That,
that was actually the same day, or the same week at least, that the Italian forensic scientists came out with their article in Wired Italia. So that was like a deflection situation.
oh, I didn't know that. That's quite
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
because it's really quite mocking, the Letterman piece, which you can see on YouTube. There's just so many things the audience can't appreciate this without looking into it, and it's such a messy topic because there are people paid to disrupt everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, just as an example, I mean, there are videos you can find of Paul McCartney going somewhere, like let's say somewhere in Eastern Europe, and somebody will ask him, "What was the most outrageous, you know, thing that ever happened to you as a Beatle or whatever?" And he'll just say, "Well, basically, no, nothing outrageous has ever happened to me."
Yeah.
And you're sitting there saying, "Wait a minute. If you had gone through this thing where there are all these rumors that you're dead,"
Mm-hmm.
right? And it became a major topic in the media, you'd think you would pay attention to that. You could remember it, right?
Yeah, that was the video of Fall in Red Square. So that was Moscow. And he was asked about what was the most unusual rumor about him. And he said, "Oh, I can't think." And then he's flipping off the interviewer when he's saying that. And somebody yells from the audience saying, "Oh, are you natural or double?" And he says, "It's a secret and I can't tell you."
Yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, I could understand if you were the real person and you had these rumors that it would get to you at some point. But I don't think that that's the way he's been playing it. The way he's been playing it is in a mocking way all along. And so, and then, like you're saying, 400 clues and movies and animated skits and all kinds of things. So I don't know. I think it looks more like they're playing us as suckers than anything else. But then again, I'm a little bit biased in this. But uh, what other things can we see from, let's say, McCartney after that? Like when he was in Wings, weren't there all kinds of things there that seem somewhat revealing?
Well, there's that red rose, um, with the red rose stuck in his mouth. And to me, that's a clue. It possibly, we mentioned earlier, is he a Rosicrucian? Well, possibly, and he's being forced to keep silent. For me, that's a really creepy symbol on that Red Rose Speedway album.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's a song somebody reversed gratitude, and it says, I was Willie Campbell. And that's one of the names that has come up in the research as being possibly a Fall, or Fall's real name. So,
Well, there's also with Wings, there are a lot of questions. Some of these images they've used, like a ram in this situation, and some of these have meaning in different secret societies.
Even
And
the Beatles, even the Beatles itself, plane is an Egyptian symbol for the scarab for life, right?
Yes, and so you kind of wonder. I mean, also, even though they may have been in a positive sense, I mean, if you have people like Brian Epstein, who was a British intelligence guy, right? Around you and promoting you and whatever, and you're just some young guys who like music, you might not really quite realize how they're setting you, what directions they're setting you into, right? They're just going to tell you, well, the Beatles, that sounds like a good, a good name because, we're going to have a rock beat and all that. And you may not realize the imagery that they want to present. So, it's a complicated story. But once you start talking about Wings, though, it's hard. It looks very, very deliberate, everything. And I would think that at that point, the band and McCartney would have had all the control over it that they wanted.
Wings, yeah. I also think it's interesting that Denny Lane was in that band, because I do think Denny Lane was a Fall. So putting him in Wings, people said, oh, well, he couldn't have been Fall because he was in Wings with Fall. Well, he could have pretended to be Paul walking into EMI Studios. It doesn't mean he can't also be in Wings. That it kind of throws people off. And Wings, Wings on an angel. Wings, waiting in the wings to be Paul. I mean, there are different interpretations for that. It's yeah, I don't know. It's
Yeah, I also think that with McCartney, there are times when, in songs and in speech, he's broken into more of a North American English. And, he might have, some people have speculated he came from Canada. And I don't know, but there are definitely times when I don't think he sounded like somebody from the British Isles.
Right. Well, people think that he might come from Canada based in part on the Ontario Provincial Police patch that's on the Sgt. Pepper album. That was tampered to look like OPD, which is officially pronounced dead. So was that a clue as to where Fall came from? Maybe they just wanted to have OPD, and that's something that they could use to make it look like that. But
actually,
yeah.
What I would like to know, and I haven't seen in any of all this research, is who were some of the people working on these things, like the albums, right? I mean, who chose the patches? Who chose the photographs? Who chose? Because if there are 400 clues, then somebody worked on at least a couple hundred of them. I mean, they weren't all. I mean, there might have been some accidents or whatever, but somebody made that Sgt. Pepper's album cover. You know what I mean? There are concrete people or teams or whatever who worked on these things, and it's like we can't get any information about these folks.
Yeah, I think the assumption is that the Beatles and George Martin were making these decisions, but it's a good point. I mean, I know that people like Jeff Emmerich were in the studio helping to make, well, in my opinion, make Fall sound more like Paul by slowing down. For example, if She's Leaving Home, that song was slowed down. And so if you slow down the higher pitched voice, it sounds more like a lower pitched voice. So make Fall sound more like Paul. Now,
that's another question. Maybe his voice, the timbre, it's a little higher.
Yeah, it is.
One other thing,
even in old age, I mean, how many people have a higher pitch, when they're 30 or 40 years older.
Just Michael Jackson, which was
Okay.
my next question. I was going to ask her, what is there some type of weird relationship between McCartney and Jackson? And I'm just thinking of the Say 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 video. And in that video, you've got McCartney walking around essentially as a snake oil salesman, conning everybody, right?
That's right.
It's almost like another in-your-face kind of joke.
That's what I think too. Very good observation. Yep. Well, I just think that Fall wasn't a very strong songwriter. Mal Evans said in 75 that he had helped write songs for Sgt. Pepper. And he was promised royalties that he was never paid. So in my opinion, I don't think Fall is a very strong songwriter, so he needs people to help him. So he asked Michael Jackson, he asked George Harrison, he asked Stevie Wonder, or whoever he did Ebony and Ivory with.
One more question, just because you mentioned the name earlier, and it's kind of a little bit out in left field, but what do you make of Howard Hughes? Do you think he was replaced, or do you think that, that senile old person, germaphobe, do you think that was really him?
No, I think he was replaced, actually. I tend to suspect that when there's a big Hollywood movie, it's to push some story, some propaganda. So they're trying to convince people, oh yeah, he was just a senile old guy who went crazy. But there's a lot of research out there about how Howard Hughes was actually replaced by two of his own doubles. And he was talking about how somebody's death could be covered up for years using the existing technology. As long as you can, quote, get somebody on the phone, that's enough for most people to think somebody's still alive, but it could just have been a computer running they probably had more advanced computers back then than people realized, but...
Yeah, and I mean, he was definitely a hardcore elitist, too. Like, he was a serious player.
Yeah, so... Yeah, I don't know.
Jerry, did you know that there was a book published, I don't know, a couple years ago, essentially from, a writer, but who had help from somebody who claimed to be Hughes's new wife after he started his second life?
No, I'll have to check that out.
And there's a tremendous amount of evidence that her story was legit. I mean, basically, the story, if you buy it, is that he hated his life. I mean, he liked doing things with planes and technology and various other things, but he did not want to be unable to, walk on the streets or whatever. And so that got set up as a fake death or a replacement. And he took the identity of a CIA pilot who was lost in Central America. And because he was a pilot, he was a CIA kind of guy, he was in that world. And this second wife, had all kinds of photos and evidence, and it actually looked quite strong to me. I mean, we can't prove it. You'd have to go read the book and see what you think. But because there's another angle to this, and Tina, we don't really have time to do it justice, but somebody could just not be happy with his life, right? I mean, there's a lot of talk that Elvis Presley saw himself as being in a downward spiral that was hopeless. Money being lost, having to go out at night because he couldn't walk on the streets, even like everybody's trying to grab his toilet. Right, to sell his what he's left behind, right? Imagine how miserable life would be if you couldn't, you have to go out at 3 a.m, right? Because you can't go outside, right? There, I'm not saying it's true, but there's a case to be made that Elvis didn't die, that he faked his death because, he was in such a miserable situation and the money was being mismanaged and so on and so forth, and so he just wanted out of there. And whether that happened or not, you can imagine somebody being in that situation. You just say, look, this situation's got to go. I got to get out of here. And Howard Hughes could well have been in that situation.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing about Michael Jackson as well. I've heard speculation that he may have faked his own death as well.
Oh, Michael Jackson. Yeah, well, he might have been replaced years before. I mean, that's a pretty extreme difference from Beat It to when he died.
Yeah.
And again, people say plastic surgery, but you have the problem with it's a singer, and messing around with somebody's nose is not a good idea. Because Barbara
Well, that one
Streisand talked about that. She had considered rhinoplasty, but it could have destroyed her voice, her career.
Well, that's that's another question. And then, with today's technology, it's more and more that they can modify sound so much that they probably have options that they didn't have, 20 or 30 years ago.
Oh, sure. Voice morphing technology. They can make anybody sound like anybody. So it'd be very easy.
I mean, they could take this, us talking now, and change it so that all of us had a British accent.
Sure.
And still sound like us, right? You know what I mean? The ability that they have now is so overwhelming that it really does raise some questions about modern characters like, Michael Jackson or something. But but still, you need, the thing with the McCartney case, though, is there's just a tremendous amount of evidence. And people just don't want to look at it because it would ruin their worldview. They don't want to be told they've been lied to for 30 years or whatever, 40 years or something. But, well, I tell you what, we're getting to where we can just about wrap it up for today, Tina. Are there any closing thoughts or things that you think we might want our listeners would benefit from?
Well, I didn't get to talk about all of the forensic evidence that proves Paul was replaced. And for most doubles, we do not have the benefit of forensic scientists investigating our suspected doubles. So I would hope that people would look at their evidence and decide for themselves, of course, but it's pretty compelling. And then realize that something happened, and hopefully we won't let it happen in the future to other people, or at least be aware that it happens. And I mean, honestly, I would like justice for Paul, but am I ever going to get that? Is it ever going to be publicly acknowledged that Paul, the real Paul, is gone and this imposter has been pretending to be him for longer than Paul was even alive? Probably not. But it's enough for me that people are looking into it and more people are seeing it. And then,
well, we're still waiting for justice for Shakespeare.
But Paul McCartney and the Beatles can be reframed and seen for what they were, and not have it all muddied together with Fall and the other imposters. So it's like two separate bands that were going on and two separate agendas. And I think the Beatles were a great band, and the Beatles were used for evil.
Well, Tina, I think there's something that, if first of all, people should go to your website. Okay, you want to tell people your website?
Yes, that's plasticmacca.blogspot.com. And it's Plastic Macca, Macca.
Mm-hmm. And Macca is the slang word used in Britain for Paul McCartney.
Right.
And I think on your website you have a lot of these forensic things. And, some of it is really simple. One thing that stands out to me is there's a great deal of evidence that the ears around late 1966, that Paul McCartney was wearing like fake ears or had ear surgery, major ear surgery or whatever. Something was going on there. Mm-hmm. And you look at that and it's kind of like, that's hard to explain. I mean, you can understand covering up if you had a tooth knocked out or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can understand why a famous person would do that. But what's going on with the ears? There's just so much of this that people aren't aware of. And the reason, I think, is that back then we didn't have things like the internet. They just couldn't combine resources the way we can.
Yeah, but people still knew something was wrong, which I think is interesting. They picked up on it. And a lot of people were talking about it. And I was actually chastised once by a friend of mine who said that I keep saying on my interviews that, it was a rumor that Paul was dead. She said, no, it was a fact. Everybody knew Paul was dead.
Well, clearly a lot of people did know, and that's how it kind of broke out. And maybe that was a controlled release. Maybe they wanted it out.
That Paul was dead?
Mm-hmm. Maybe they planned it. Well, I mean, they knew they couldn't hide it forever, so they wanted it to go out in a controlled way, maybe.
And then they
Not,
could suppress it. Oh, and then if people talk about it later, they think it's just a hoax. Well, that is possible. But
well, I mean, they look, they want to control all sides of debates, right? I mean, they want to have, right? I mean, you can see it's like you watch some TV show and they've got, you know, a guy's pretending to be on the left, who works for the CIA, arguing with a guy who pretends to be on the right, who works for the CIA.
sure.
But they're all CFR members, and then they have a guest come on who's a CFR member, and it's like, well, this is as phony as can be. There's no debate here. There's just three guys getting together who all work for the same person, right? David Rockefeller or whoever the oligarchs are. But okay, well, I think we can wrap it up. As far as if there's any last forensics that you wanted to get into other than suggesting people go to your website, are there any kind of like, I don't know what you want to call it, silver magic bullets there that you think really are worth people knowing?
Well, the only other ones I didn't mention were the different teeth that couldn't be explained, the different ears that couldn't be explained, the different head shape, skull shape that couldn't be explained. And these were just some of the differences that the forensic scientists noticed and talked about in their article. And there are many other differences that people have picked up on. So different height, different eye color, different arm hair, different feet. And people have looked at a lot of differences. And it's too overwhelming, especially when you consider a good double. You can't tell the difference. And one little thing can give away a double, and they're like 40 here, so.
Well, then that's another thing. Maybe this is proof that the dumbing down agenda has been quite successful. Because you would think people would notice a little bit more that some of these differences, they do seem rather significant to me. But I think it's also that, the video and sound and everything is so manipulated today that nothing really sounds natural anymore.
No, that's true. But to talk about the dumbing down agenda, Yuri Bezmenov did talk about how one of the agendas, now that's the KGB defector, in case people don't know who Yuri Bezmenov was, but he talked about how that agenda, that the people would be demoralized and then they couldn't actually make decisions and they couldn't rationally think about these. When they're demoralized, they can't come to rational decisions. So I would say that this Paul McCartney situation, in the face of all this evidence, forensic evidence of all these differences, the only logical conclusion to draw is that it's a different person. But that is very hard for some people.
I tell you what, Tina, I got one last question for you.
Sure.
You're a lawyer. How does this research go over with your fellow lawyers?
Well, I don't really talk about it with fellow lawyers. I've had lawyers contact me and say that I have a blog post that talks about how photographs are evidence of identity. And a lawyer did post on there and said, well, it's obviously a different person, basically. So I guess because, lawyers are used to researching, they're used to drawing logical deductions. They might not be looking into this sort of, fringe conspiracy theory stuff, but I think if they're actually presented with it, that they would be able to draw the same conclusion I did. And actually, one of my lawyer friends who was talking about George Bush having an imposter throw that baseball, he's looked at the research. He seems to agree with me that Paul was replaced.
Because I know I used to spend a fair bit of time looking into the question of who wrote Shakespeare, and going to meetings and events where people were interested in this topic. A very high percentage of the people were actually lawyers, and that included people like a Supreme Court justice. I mean, it was fairly high up the food chain, but the higher ones couldn't take a firm stand. They just had to say, "I'm interested in the topic." But Right? They wouldn't say something like, "Yeah, I think the Earl of Oxford was involved" or something like that. You could tell that they did, but they just couldn't officially say that. They had to pretend to be neutral.
Well, Billy Shears is the name used on Sergeant Pepper.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's possible that it's a reference to William Shakespeare, who was, like you said, probably not a real person, but somebody using that, an alias or a pen name.
A project, yes.
So to me, Billy Shears could again be just another hint that that's not the real Paul. So.
Yeah, it has that feeling to me too. But in any case, the thing is, this is an interesting topic that people can look into, and surprisingly, there is, like you said, so much forensic evidence out there. And when you start talking about Shakespeare, you're starting to get 400 years ago and all the documents and everything. It's really just more a circumstantial case that you don't think a guy can write about Italy and the law and all these other topics when he wasn't in that world. But in the case of the Beatles, you can see there's just, the size, how big the head shape, for example. I mean, it just doesn't change. And anyway, it's a very interesting topic. And Tina, we thank you for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's a wrap, folks. Thanks, everyone. Take care.